I want to thank you for humoring me with that opening hymn. That's not one we sing a lot, I know. But you know, there's a certain term used in Daniel 4 that's used nowhere else in the Bible. Any of you know what term that is? Has to do with that song that we sang at the beginning of this service. It's the only song in our hymnal that uses that term in relating it to these particular beings that we sing about. Remember, that was number 91. What was its title? Ye Watchers and Ye Holy Ones. Daniel is the only one in the scriptures that uses that term. And I think there's a lesson in that term for us today. But let's just talk about where we're headed now, and we'll get to that term as we get to it in the scriptures, all right? We're looking at Daniel 4 in our series on Daniel. And we're beginning to get acquainted with the author of this chapter. Who's the author of chapter 4 in Daniel? Do you remember? You might accidentally just automatically say Daniel, of course, right? Who's the author of chapter 4? Yes. Take a look at it. Chapter 4 of Daniel, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world. So was this some private little communication that Nebuchadnezzar was giving to some of his courtiers or something? King Nebuchadnezzar wrote this chapter as his personal testimony about the great God of heaven. You know, some of the Jewish rabbis got a little upset at Nebuchadnezzar. They said he stole all this from David because he writes like a psalmist here in this chapter. You can find references about they're worried that he's becoming a little too much like King David here in his praise of God. I think that's a good thing. What do you think? This is Nebuchadnezzar's personal testimony about the great God of heaven. You know what amazes me? This is one chapter in Daniel that has just really grabbed my heart. And I think in particular, Seventh-day Adventist Christians need to learn a big lesson from this chapter. Let me just tell you a little story before I go down and get on with the study of this chapter. I was pastoring in the little town of Elkton, Virginia, right at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And in that little town, there were a few other Christian churches with pastors. And they had a little ministerial association. And so we would get together about once a month, these 5 to 6 of us in that little town. And so most of the pastors would bring their Big Mac, you know, or what do you call it? Yeah, they went to McDonald's, you know, they'd bring their hamburger or whatever. And I'd bring, of course, you know, my gluten sandwich or whatever, avocado sandwich or whatever I could get a hold of. And not long before I left Elkton, there was a new pastor that moved into the area in one of these churches. And of course, as we often did in that ministerial group, we would usually pick on the new guy to be the president. And so the local Catholic priest became the president. And he had noticed as we ate lunches that my lunch was different from the other fellows. I hadn't advertised it, he just had noticed it. So happened that he was a vegetarian. And so he was trying to come up with something to do for the pastors, and he asked me if I would present the next program for the pastors. And he said, I would like you to present to the pastors why it is that we should live healthfully. And why that's a part of your church. And so I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. But let me tell you, why don't we meet in the basement of our church in our fellowship hall, and we'll provide the meal, and we'll provide you a good, healthful vegetarian meal. So you know Sue was involved in that one, of course. I wasn't the cook. And so we had our vegetarian meal, and the fellows loved it. They loved it, especially the Catholic priests. And after the fellows had all kind of dispersed, he hung around a little bit, and he said, "Would you come preach that at my Wednesday night Mass?" And I said, "I'd love to do that." So he says, "Well, next Wednesday night, at the end of Mass, we have a fellowship dinner. And I want you to come and share why healthful living is important from the Bible and how that has played out in the history of your church." And I said, "I can do that?" "Sure." I said, "I'd be happy to do that." And of course, to their little fellowship dinner that night, I brought a vegetarian entree from you-know-who. And, after that evening, I got to do my presentation to his congregation. And they had all dispersed, and he said, do you have a few minutes you could just come visit in the rectory with me?" I said, "Sure." So we went into his rectory there, attached to the church. And he was kind of a handyman fellow. And he led me through all the rooms there in his rectory, showing me all the stuff that he'd just done to fix up his place. He was so proud of his remodeling efforts. And then we sat down, and he fixed us some of the nicest herbal tea. And we sat there and just drank the herbal tea and had a wonderful fellowship in the Lord that night. And before I left, I said, "Would you mind if I just have prayer for you and your ministry here in Elkton?" And that was one night that the local Adventist preacher prayed for the local Catholic priest that the Lord would bless his ministry according to his will in that town of Elkton and richly fill him with his Holy Spirit. Now, some people would criticize me for that, but I don't think God did. I felt it was the Spirit's leading through that whole process. Why do I tell you that story in connection with Daniel 4? Some people think Adventists are Catholic haters. And there are some Adventists that give them good reason to think that. And I want to be one pastor here in this town to tell you that Adventists should not be and are not Catholic haters. We are Catholic lovers. That's not the only time I've ever preached in a Catholic church. I did it right up in Scott Valley in the little town of Etna. And some people came that Thanksgiving Day to see what would happen when the Adventist preacher preached in the Catholic church. But I preached the gospel there in that Catholic church. And I felt privileged to have that platform to do so. I want you to see that in the old Babylon, that's the spiritual symbol and forerunner of what we're really concerned about in the end time, right? That's described in Revelation very clearly, and the fall of which is described in Revelation 17 and 18. I want you to see that in the original, that though God did not approve of a system, God reached in and touched the people in the system because they were his children. You remember in Revelation, there's a little text that says, "Come out of her," who? Who? "My people." And I'll tell you, I want that to describe me. I want to be one of God's people. And I want you to see today how God miraculously, the only things that God can do here, reaches into the midst of Babylon of old, that Neo-Babylonian empire, and grabs the heart of the leader, the greatest leader that the Neo-Babylonian power ever had. Do you remember how we've met Nebuchadnezzar so far in this book of Daniel? Remember, of course, we have him testing Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, remember, as they had finished their university course there in the University of Babylon in chapter 1. And what did Nebuchadnezzar find out in his first contact with these men of God? What did he find out? He found out they were wise, that there was something unique about these men. He found out that these men these young men, who had stood that test there in the university and stood up for what they knew to be right, he found out that God had blessed these men. And I'm sure that Nebuchadnezzar, I don't think he was any dummy, because he seemed to be in charge of the oral examinations of the university. I think he was a wise man himself. I think he'd been trained with all the wisdom that Babylon could muster. And he was obviously a very astute leader. After all, if you study the history of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, not only is he the greatest king, but his rule, his reign, lasted the majority of the time that the kingdom did. His reign lasted longer than all the other kings combined until the Medes and the Persians took over. So he was quite a fellow, and so I don't think it was lost on him, this lesson, when he tested those 4 young men. And he began to note something was unique and unusual about these worshipers of Yahweh, these Jewish young men who had a strange and foreign God to him. You remember, of course, they had all been given new names in the attempt to help them understand about Babylonians' wonderful gods, right? We talked about all that. And remember in chapter 2, of course, Nebuchadnezzar's next exposure was when he was ready to destroy all the wise men of Babylon because they couldn't remember his lost dream for him. Remember that? And then there was that young man who came in and told him what that dream was that he had forgotten. But that young man, remember, what had he told him about his own wisdom? When Daniel came in to Nebuchadnezzar, what had he said about his own wisdom? Do you remember? He didn't really have it, did he? He didn't know it. Even though he'd been one of those at the top of his class, probably the top student in the whole university class that year, he said, I don't have enough wisdom, but I have a God. There's a great God in heaven who has made known to me your dream and who will now tell you the interpretation of that dream. And you remember that large statue we talked all about. And what was the next exposure to Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel? Chapter 3, of course. And you remember, it's probably been 10 years or so, and Nebuchadnezzar has had a little time to kind of think about all these things of his dream. And it seems very, very clear that the image that he has built is very closely connected to the image of his dream. And you remember, of course, that he exhibits that attitude that, well, God might say this, but I say. And he's showing with that image, with that gold image from head to foot gold, remember, what is he showing? He's showing that Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom are going to last and last and last and last. But what had the dream told him? They were only the head of gold. And the only kingdom that would ever last that long was no earthly kingdom, but was a kingdom that was the one represented by that stone cut out of a mountain, remember, without human hands. They hit that image and destroyed it, smashed it to dust. God's kingdom would be the only kingdom that would last forever. But remember how God worked with Nebuchadnezzar through all that? And what happened back there in chapter 3, the last time we got together? Where had God led Nebuchadnezzar in his experience, his personal experience at the end? Remember when he looked in that fire after his extreme anger, so angry that his anger caused the death of many of his best soldiers when they threw in the 3 Hebrew boys into the fire, remember? And Nebuchadnezzar had looked in there, and he was the one who said, that 4th one in there looks like what? Yeah, looks like the Son of God or a son of the God. Some people try to translate it. He obviously knew it was divinity, and it was something beyond him. And of course, he knew there was only one God connected to those 3 young men. He had no mistake there. He knew that that would be their God. And what had he said about God there in chapter 3? Do you remember? Chapter 3, verse 28. Yes, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. That's how far he's come. And now this seems, if we study the history, it's probably quite a few years now from the last time to this chapter. Many place this chapter in the last third or less of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. His whole reign was 43 years in length. Many think it probably happened around the mid-30s in his reign. But in any event, he had had quite a lengthy exposure to the God of Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah that he had, of course, mistakenly named Belteshazzar and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. Now let's read the story. Chapter 4, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure, he says, to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. Actually, he has quite some interesting poetry here. We won't get into all those details. But like I said, the Talmudic rabbis exclaim the king has stolen all the songs and praises from David. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. Notice, he's come to that conclusion finally. Has he learned a lesson? He's learned one, hasn't he? His dominion endures from generation to generation. And then he tells us his story, his personal story. If you want to touch the people's heart, you need to tell your personal story. That's one of the reasons I opened up with a personal story today. I could have just told you to love your Catholic brothers and sisters. But would that have the impact of my telling you my story? You're going to remember that story, I hope. I remember it. I can never get that out of my heart and my mind. So privileged to come close to one of God's children and be treated so wonderfully and so kindly by somebody who was so far different from me in their theological understandings of God and his word. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. See, he was in good shape. And from all these, since he had so many wars and things, that's where what people use to kind of place this dream a little bit, because he seems to have had a rest from some of his campaigns for a while, because he says he's contented, he's prosperous. Remember, I told you earlier there was a rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar earlier in his reign, probably about the 10th year. In fact, that rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar had been so harsh in its effect upon him. He actually had, it seems from the stories we read, he had to actually defend himself physically, personally. He had to fight in the battle there in the palace. He wasn't always at ease. Nebuchadnezzar was a great warrior and a great leader and a great general. Nebuchadnezzar was a king he was at the top of the king list when it comes to his abilities. And he knew it. That's the problem. He knew it. and he's prosperous, and he has a dream. Verse 5, I had a dream that made me afraid as I was lying in my bed. The images and the visions that passed through my mind terrified me. Imagine this great king, this great warrior, and he's scared. So I commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came, I told them the dream. So now at least he's not asking them for the dream, is he? He's going to tell them the dream. He's simply asking, what's it mean? But they could not interpret it for me. Finally, Daniel came into my presence, and I told him the dream. Now, he's called Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and the spirit of the holy gods is in him. So we get a little inkling, even when he's writing this, Nebuchadnezzar is still battling all that tradition and all that history and all those things he's been taught from the time he's a little tyke, from the time and he can remember. He's still battling all that, and we all battle those things. But did you know God still works with us through all that? Through all that mist and all that fog that we have to go through in this life, God still reaches in with his Spirit to teach us certain very important truths. He knows what we need, and he sends it to us for us to learn. And so, verse 9, I said, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Here is my dream. Interpret it for me. These are the visions I saw while lying on my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land. It says in the midst of the earth, doesn't it, King James? When you read that midst of the earth, does that bring anything? A tree in the midst of the earth. Anybody, does that ring a bell anywhere? Tree. What? The tree of life. And there was another one. Twice it's described as in the midst of the earth. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It brings back to us some shadows and some echoes of Eden itself. As we read this story, we have shadows from Eden and the tree of life versus the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We have shadows from the Tower of Babel. There are lots of reminiscent things here in this chapter, if you're really alert, that will point you to some very crucial and critical moments in human history. I don't think it's by accident we have those little echoes. I believe the Holy Spirit would have us remember those great, great moments of decision that humanity has faced. So he saw a tree in the midst of the earth. What kind of a tree? It was a large tree. Its height was enormous, he says. The tree grew large and strong, and its top reached the sky. That sounds like the Tower of Babel, doesn't it? It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the beasts of the field found shelter, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed. Who was it that was to watch over the earth and have dominion and take care of all its creatures? To whom did God give that privilege and opportunity? It was mankind. And really, that's God's goal for each one of us, especially if we have positions of power and leadership and authority. For us to be his stewards, to take care of all his wonderful creation. And Nebuchadnezzar had that privilege. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar had been used as an instrument of God. We've talked about that before, haven't we? But Nebuchadnezzar doesn't quite understand his proper relationship to this great God of the universe, does he? He is kind of taking it all for himself. Now, verse 13, in the visions I saw while lying on my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one. What does the King James call it? A watcher and a holy one. This term watcher. It's not so much the idea of guarding as the idea of being vigilant and alert. gives us the idea that God and his angels, his heavenly messengers, are always very alert to what's happening here. Nothing misses their notice. Do you ever wonder if God really sees what's happening to you? Do you ever wonder if he understands what you're going through right now? Daniel would tell us that he is always vigilant. He is always alert. He is always aware of every detail. Every detail. He knows. I know sometimes it doesn't feel like he knows, but he knows. And so this watcher and this Holy One comes down. And he called in a loud voice, verse 14, he called in a loud voice, cut down the tree and trim off its branches and strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. And let the animals flee from under it and the birds from its branches. And let the stump and its roots bound with iron and bronze remain in the ground and in the grass of the field. Have you ever cut down a tree? Over on our farm we have some trees that someone attempted to cut, but they cut them quite a ways above the ground. They're black walnuts, and they tried to cut them about 8 feet high and then graft on English walnuts onto the high graft. Well, the grafts didn't really take. The English walnuts were a dud on those particular ones. I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe the person who did it didn't know what they were doing. I'm not sure. They needed to have Keith Carup out there doing it. He knows his stuff. But those old barren black walnut stumps sitting there, if you go out there today, there are just leaves and branches all over the place. If you leave a stump in the ground, something's probably going to happen if you haven't dug it out or poisoned it or whatever. So this gives us a little hope for Nebuchadnezzar here. The stump is still there. But notice what happens now. Let him be drenched. Notice the pronoun here switches to him. This alone should have helped Nebuchadnezzar to get a little clue. You know what I believe, my personal conviction? I believe Nebuchadnezzar already thought that this dream was about him. But he didn't want to accept it. And he was hoping against hope that it was about someone else. You see, if you study carefully, both in biblical and non-biblical literature of the time, a tree was a very common symbol of mankind. In fact, one of Nebuchadnezzar's own relatives, prior to him, had used that terminology in some of his literature. You go to Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a contemporary of Daniel, remember. Go to Ezekiel 31 and you'll find Assyria, the whole nation of Assyria, being represented by a cedar tree. This was not some uncommon analogy. But we go now then from the it to him. This should have been the big clue. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. By the way, the only time period specifically mentioned besides times in Daniel 4 is a year. So you know, because we see that it's a year from the time this happens till it's told about till it occurs. Most people, most commentators, almost without exception, accept times as years. So it would suggest then, it's talking about a 7-year period. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kings of men. This is the main lesson that seems to be taught here, that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign, and that he's watching over everything that happens here, in spite of what we think today. I know we're in the midst of a great political debate in our country, and we're all concerned. Some of us are concerned that Obama's going to get in. Some of us are concerned that McCain's going to get in. And we both go to the same church. You know what I'm concerned about? I want God to lead. And whichever one he sees will be best for the whole plan of getting the gospel to this world and getting ready for the coming of Jesus. I just hope that's the person that gets in there. And as I read Daniel, I can't help but think maybe God will help direct events so that will happen. What do you think? Didn't the whole book of Daniel isn't it trying to teach us that God's involved in the affairs of mankind? Didn't we just see this watcher, how nothing passes his notice? And while those political conventions were going on, do you think God missed any of those words? Do you think God doesn't know the desires of your heart today? I believe he does. He takes all that into account. How wise he must be. And he's trying to teach hard-headed Nebuchadnezzar that lesson. So he ends by saying, this is the dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men of my kingdom can interpret it. So then Daniel interprets it, and you'll notice what happens. And we won't read every word from here on, because I know as well as you that the time is going. But you will notice that Daniel is silent for a while. What could happen to Daniel here? I'm suspicious that some of those wise men that came before Daniel might have a little inkling about what this means. I think they at least had an idea that that tree was Nebuchadnezzar. And I think they didn't have the backbone to tell him because they were afraid of their own skin. But Daniel, silent for a while, and he said, oh, may this dream be for your enemies, you know. And then he tells him about that tree is you, Nebuchadnezzar. That's you. And you'll remember that happened. And let's read about when it happened, how the tree was cut down, when it was cut down. Let's see here. The dream is fulfilled, beginning in verse 28. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later, a year later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this great Babylon I have built? You know, that was really true. That was really true. Other kings had only had one palace. He had three there. One of those was the one that was the seventh wonder of the world, where the Hanging Gardens were, remember? He had enlarged the territory of the city of Babylon 3 times over what it was when he started out. And many of the walls around Babylon were double, some of them were triple. Why, he had built something. And all those rose-colored palaces and those beautiful white temples. There were over 50 temples in Babylon. And not to mention all the religious sites beyond, the more minor ones. Hundreds of those. He had done something no other king had ever done. I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty. Verse 31, the words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. And this is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken away from you. You will be driven away from the people, away. Will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle. There are some psychologists and psychiatrists who've tried to trace his mental illness, and most of them say it's lycanthropy or boanthropy or one of those things where people think they're animals, you know. People have done that through the ages. And they've actually lived like the animals. So this is not totally unusual. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kings of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people, ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle. See, it must have been matted. Have you ever seen some people that live outdoors and don't have homes or whatever, and you can tell that they haven't had baths for a while or shampoo in their hair, right? That was the way Nebuchadnezzar was. A severe example of it. And his nails like the claws of a bird. I've seen some people with some claws about like that. And they weren't that clean either, to be honest with you. At that time, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. You know, I believe that this experience of Nebuchadnezzar is simply an extreme example of what happens to you and me apart from God. Did you know there are a whole lot of people in our world today that teach our children in school and teach us as they can that we are simply one of the animals anyway? We're nothing but a high form of an animal, and we're just a little more evolved. There are many people today who act and reason very much like the animals today. A lot of people eat pretty much everything animals eat too. Let me tell you, apart from God, we are just as sad a case of humanity as Nebuchadnezzar was in his insanity. We are. That's just an extreme example of where we are apart from God. So what's the solution to our impotent humanity, to our totally out of control animal impulses? What's the solution? Same thing happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We need to raise our eyes toward heaven. He said, I raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored. What a coincidence, huh? Raise his eyes toward heaven and his sanity is restored. He knows it's no coincidence. He knows where the power is. He knows where the true sanity is. He's finally getting the point. But what has he gone through to get there? He says, then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion, not my dominion, see? His dominion. There are a lot of people would think, continue to teach, even in the Christian church today, that we are immortal. We last forever. The human spirit is forever and eternal. That is so anti-biblical. The only truly eternal thing is God. We seek immortality, the Bible says, and we receive it as a gift from God. And it's his wonderful, marvelous, gracious gift that he gives us. Eternal life. I can hardly wait for that day to see so many of our friends. By the way, if you want to go to Arlene's memorial today, remember there will be cars in the parking lot at 2:30. Won't Don be excited that day when God gives Arlene the gifts of eternal life? The Bible says it happens. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers. I think he's talking from his perspective. I don't think God would phrase it that way myself. I like to remember this is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Because Jesus tells me that he knows the numbers of the hair on my head. Jesus tells me that I'm far more valuable than those little sparrows that he takes note of every time they have trouble. Jesus told me that he loves me with an eternal love, and he demonstrated it by giving his life for me. But Nebuchadnezzar learned that no one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? In verse 36, he says, at the same time that my sanity was restored. Isn't this an interesting thing? His honor and splendor were returned for the glory of his kingdom. He says, my advisors and nobles sought me out. I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. This reminds me a little bit of the story of Job. Remember how everything was restored and he had more than he had when he started? I wonder if it's always that way when we accept God in our lives and we allow God to direct our lives. Do we really end up with more than we began with? Oh, we sure do. Always. There's never an exception to that rule. Verse 37. Now, here it is. This is it. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he's like me, he said, he is able to humble. Can you imagine? Nebuchadnezzar was the king that we meet in chapter 1 that had just destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Now, he didn't do that when he took Daniel. He finished it, remember, when he came back a couple more times. But he was the king, remember, who had taken all those wonderful sacred vessels from the temple that are over there in Belshazzar's feast later on in Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar's the one that did all that. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who had led his soldiers to destroy so many people of God's people and mutilated many of the captives. Nebuchadnezzar was in charge of all that stuff. I'm sure at the height of his power and glory, he even gloried in some of his cruel acts, just like the Assyrians did. Nebuchadnezzar was the head honcho of Babylon. Is he worth God trying to reach him as a person? Doesn't it say something about your wonderful God of heaven, that he would spend time through all of that with all the terrible things Nebuchadnezzar had done to try to reach him, to save him in his kingdom? Is there any one of us here that God does not love and care for? That God does not tailor the works and the events and all the things that happen in life? If we will allow, he will work through that and reach our heart until finally we understand that our only hope is to raise our eyes toward heaven. Our only hope is to have God in charge of our life. Our only hope is not in anything that we can do, but what God can do for us. Oh, I love Daniel 4. And I'm so glad that the God that I know and love loved Nebuchadnezzar. I want to be like that. Don't you want to be that kind of person? We look beyond all labels, look beyond all the earthly outside stuff, and want to treat that person that you're with just like God treats you. Just like God treated Nebuchadnezzar.